Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Q&As. It's Thursday morning, so hopefully everybody had enough time to get their questions in. So let's jump in and see what we got. First up, Daniel Yochana wanted to follow up from the conversation last week about splitting the output of a supergun. And the first thing that I suggested he test was if there was a resistor in the SCART head that dropped the sync to proper voltage levels, like I had tested in the review that I had done. And Daniel said his friend got the cable from AshenWorks linked on the same page as the supergun, so let's hope that there's a resistor in there. But I strongly recommend you and everybody else using a supergun just double check. And the easiest way is just to pop the SCART head open and see if you see a resistor on it. But if not, just use a multimeter to test the cable. And I mean any multimeter, an $8 thing from AliExpress, they should all be able to do this. And you just touch the sync pin on both sides and see what the reading is. And this is usually the setting, maybe not usually, but often the setting that when you touch the two probes together, it beeps. So that way you know if you're just touching ground on both sides. But when you have something with resistance in it, the multimeter often just reads resistance. And anything between 350 and 600 should be fine, but you really should be having some resistance on there because you don't want to mess up any of your equipment. Also, the suggestion I made was to just find the cheapest powered dual output SCART device, which may end up being a switch, which even if that's useless, if you have no other SCART equipment, it's still going to save you some money. So Daniel said Otaku Store has a 6-in 3-out version that's a little cheaper, so you might get that one. So it'll be slightly less overkill. So yeah, it's less overkill than the 10-in 3-out, and it will save you some money. Also, I had heard some feedback about one of the SCART splitters that I had talked about last week. Some people said older versions created some interference and the newer versions didn't. But I haven't personally tested it, and you could call this gatekeeping if you'd like, but when it comes to SCART equipment that could always have some potential for interference or danger, I like to test it myself before making any recommendations. So I removed the link, and sorry if the product is flawless now, but it's just one of those things where I'd rather err on the side of caution. So maybe one day I'll be able to borrow one and just run it through its tests and see what happens. And maybe we'll have more open source stuff available soon that we could just start making, or maybe a company could just make small runs for people who need it. But anyway, let us know what happens, and hopefully that's all you need for your setup. Next up, Lloyd Smart said they received their SVS and are delighted with it. This thing is awesome. So I'll show a picture for anybody that's watching this and not listening audio only. Lloyd has, at the moment, just 3 inputs and 1 output, which I think is one of the coolest features of the scalable video switch, because it's really easy to dive in and imagine your, 20 input, 4 output setup. But what if people just need 3 in and 1 out? And what if you're going into a TINC 4K, so you specifically want a VGA output or something like that? So thanks for sending this picture. I think this was very cool, and I think this is a really great example of how you don't need to go crazy with this stuff, and you still might have an amazing setup. But to continue with what Lloyd was talking about, they said they're in the process of acquiring a PC CRT for 480p for Dreamcast and Wii, which will sit beside their PVM that they use for 240p 480i. They decided against getting the plasma for now. All right, so I'm going to interrupt you here and just say that I love this solution. And I think that if people want pro-level monitors, getting just a 15 kilohertz PVM and trying to be patient and find a nice PC CRT monitor will be infinitely cheaper than trying to find a multi-format PVM, but you could use PC CRTs at multiple different refresh rates as well, which is a shameless teaser for a video I have coming up soon. But so sorry for my interruption here, but I just wanted to pat you on the back and say I think this is going to be an awesome setup. But let's continue. They were pleasantly surprised to find that VGA output module on the SVS includes an optional RGBS to RGB HV circuit, which sounds ideal for their use case as they currently have their consoles hooked up to the SVS via the retro gaming cable's SCART cables, which are obviously RGBS. Their plan is to have one VGA output module in RGBS mode hooked up to their PVM via a VGA to BNC cable, and another VGA output module in RGB HV mode hooked up to the PC CRT. The questions are, if they accidentally forget to turn off the PVM and end up sending it 480p RGBS, is that dangerous? Could I damage it? Yes, definitely, but also no. So I've done that a lot, and mostly not on purpose. And usually what happens is you get a double image and the screen looks crazy, and I would imagine, I'm guessing here, that if you left it like that for a while, or if you did that a lot, you could potentially damage your PVM, especially because all this stuff is now 20, 30 years old. However, if you just do it by accident once and you go, oh crap, and you turn it off, this is not like a explode your monitor scenario. I would kind of in your mind approach it that way though, just because you don't want to wear out this older equipment any faster than it has to be, especially something like a really nice 20L4. So that's one of those things where you probably aren't going to damage it, but I personally, just my opinion, would treat it like you could, just to make sure that your stuff lasts as long as it possibly can. Next, do the computer cores on Mr. output RGB HV when using the analog I/O board? Well, any Mr. core can output RGB HV or RGBS, depending on however you have it set in the INI file. So that's going to be up to you. If so, would that damage their PVM if it received some random resolution in RGB HV? So basically, like if RGB HV was being sent and the PVM just got RGBH, would that damage it? No, but it's going to make your sync go crazy, which is going to make your monitor make some weird noises. And once again, I imagine if you left it like that for days, it would probably not be good for it. But for a quick little thing like that, no. You could try to do some fancy setups with sync combining and all of that. But if the PC cores are going to be 640 by 480 at 60 or 72 anyway, you're not going to be able to use that on your PVM. So I guess, from that perspective, I would just leave your PVM off all the time and only turn it on after you're ready to boot into whatever system you're using that's going to be on that. Lastly, is there any disadvantage to converting RGBS to RGBHV using the SVS versus using RGBHV all the way through? Like, would they be better off using a VGA input module for the Dreamcast instead of a SCART one? So, the answer to that is probably going to annoy everybody listening. If it works, there's no disadvantage, but it might not work. And it's not the SVS. It's just that a lot of these equipment, monitor, processors, any of that stuff are very sensitive to sync. And a lot of the sync that's coming out of older consoles is weird. It doesn't adhere to a strict standard, even though it kind of should. And that's especially in the case of like the Master System, TurboGrafx. Anybody who's seen those pictures of like the sync curl up in the corner, that's kind of a good example of that. So if your system is working totally fine, I would just leave it as is. And remember, the advantage of the Dreamcast SCART cable is that you could always flip it into 15 kilohertz mode and play on your PVM for anything that you feel like doing that way. Third strike in 240p mode is the very first thing that comes to mind and probably the most likely use case scenario, but you never know. Whereas if you use Dreamcast with the VGA cable, it's 480p only. And I think you said you already own it for the Dreamcast. So I would kind of try this first and just see what happens. And if you start getting any weirdness, you could try to do other things, but you already have a lot of these cables. You already have the SVS modules. Just try it and see. If you have any sync issues, you could always DM me or just, ask another question. I actually prefer if you asked here, so that way other people who have a similar setup would be able to learn from it. But I think you'll be fine. But it's one of those things like the questions you previously asked. If you flip it on and something goes crazy, just turn off the display, and then you don't have to worry about it, blowing up your display. And then we could kind of figure out what the sync issues are. But all good questions. And good luck with the setup. It looks cool. Next up, Dustin Madison was reflecting on his cough syrup suggestion from last week and said, so after looking back in retrospect on what I thought was perfectly normal, I'm now wondering if my mother was just wanting to shut a sick kid up so she could rest before getting what little sleep a parent could before work. I don't know. Maybe. I knew a lot of people growing up who said their parents used to put whiskey on their teeth when they had toothaches and stuff like that. We used to get vanilla extract, which apparently they stopped doing because kids were getting drunk off of it, basically. And I don't know. I remember loving the way it tasted. So maybe I was always just just a born booze hound or something. But that's pretty funny. I actually told my friend Patrick, who I mentioned last week, about that, and we're both going to keep our eyes open for it. And if we ever see your makeshift cough syrup booze, we're definitely going to try it just for the hell of it. Cough syrup aside, Dustin did have a question this week. Dustin ran a comedy show recently that used the same brand new JBL wireless hand mics that were previously used at the last gig and worked perfectly, but they were having connection issues this time. The connection was so loose that just walking by the mixer would jostle it and cut the signal. So what's up with that? They ended up having to use corded mics, but it bothered Dustin as they were brand new last time and hadn't been used. So I have a guess on this. In a scenario like live environments, when you're constantly plugging in and unplugging stuff, you wear out those connectors a lot quicker. So it could be, now these are all guesses, by the way. Let me preface this with I'm completely talking out of my ass, but I do have quite a lot of experience with cables. So educated guesses, but it could be that the JBL connectors on them were fine for your average use, but when you go into mixing boards that are 20 years old that have had every night a cable inserted and removed, it might actually not be thick enough to make the connection. And it could just be coincidence that the corded mics you used have slightly thicker pins. Now, these are all supposed to be standardized, down to the absolute fraction of a millimeter, but that's just not how manufacturing works. You're going to get the same run of 10,000 mics that they made. The first one off the assembly line is going to fit slightly different than the last one, and it's just the nature of the beast here. So my guess is a couple of things. First, the connectors were just worn out, and it was a lucky coincidence that the wired mics you used had prongs that were the right thickness, or even a connector itself that was the right thickness to sit in there and hold it steady. It could be that the JBLs had an issue, and maybe there was a manufacturing thing with that. You might want to write to their support and just see if they had any issues, and you're probably going to get treated like crap, like most customer support these days. I've never messaged JBL, by the way. I might have actually with their speakers. I think they might have gotten back to me, but I have low expectations with customer service these days. So that's something you could check. Now, you mentioned dirt and dust. So that's always a possibility, and that's always something that could come up as maybe just like NES cartridges. Maybe you plugged in your wireless mic and it was really dirty, but just the insertion and the friction kind of cleaned up the connectors, and then you plugged in the wired, and then now the connections are cleaner, and that's why it worked. That is potential to have happened. But I think when you're dealing with live gigs, or in the case of 30, 40-year-old consoles, which is how this is completely still relevant to our fellow retro gaming nerds here, when you're dealing with stuff that has been inserted and removed a gazillion times over decades, you're going to get wear and tear like that. And that's why you have occasions where you put in an AV DIN and you got to like wiggle it before you get signal and stuff like that. And that's why a lot of people, I think it's Saturns, a lot of people I know have had to replace their DIN on Saturns for this exact reason. I might be wrong about which console it was, but there was definitely one over the years that was far more common than the others to have this issue. Definitely happened to me on a Genesis 1. So I think for stuff like this, you could probably get a bag of tricks ready for when this happens next time, but you should expect it with live gigs and old equipment like that, the same way anybody else listening should expect it when plugging in older consoles. And that's why one of the gazillion reasons I always say buy your cables from reputable resellers. All the ones on RetroRGB are cables that have been vetted. I don't buy them every month to continue to revet them, so if there's problems, let me know. But that's the difference between buying a $3 AliExpress cable is there's a lot of stuff that goes into making sure cables fit right. That's also one of the reasons why HD Retrovision cables are so expensive, is the QA process that Steve wrote to test each of these cables is crazy, because he wanted to make sure you don't have this issue. So there's always that middle ground there. So that's a really, really annoying thing to happen, because the biggest difference between what the retro gaming examples I'm using and the example Dustin had is that if you have your retro gaming setup where you're plugging in your cable and you're getting weird connection drops, you could kind of just make it work for the time being and worry about it whenever. But when you have a live gig, especially if people are already showing up, and I mean, the only thing worse than what you just explained is if you were in the middle of the show and the mic dropped out and you had to stop your show to fix the mic. That's nightmare scenarios. So maybe come up with a bag of tricks for the next one. Bring a compressed air, or there's those new rechargeable compressed air things that supposedly work pretty good. So you could just take that, make sure it's charged before the gig, blow it out with the connectors out with compressed air, both yours and the venues, and I don't know, bring like a dual density brush or something. Anybody else watch Ammo NYC Restore Cars? I bought one of those because I just thought it was so cool, and that way you could really get in there if you see one that is dirty or rusty. Bring some deoxit with you just in case. Now, no venue is going to want to watch you spray liquid into their connectors, even though this is the exact purpose. But bring it anyway and talk to the sound people and see what they say. A good venue with good sound people are probably going to already have stuff like that and know it. But anybody that's played any live gigs before knows there's another dark side to that. I've set up my own soundboards before. There was the venues that I had to set up because they didn't have anybody there that knew how to work it. I've also been at gigs where if you even go near the soundboard, they'll try to throw you out. So I don't know. This is, if this is live stuff for you, you just have so many hurdles. So I know I probably talked way too long about this answer, but this is one of those things that directly applies to all of retro gaming, all of audio cables, live gigs, like whenever you're plugging stuff into stuff, this is exactly the things that you run into. So hopefully I was able to give you any good info and not just ramble. One more from Lloyd Smart. Lloyd bought a Dreamcast that was pre-modded with a GDMU, Noctua fan, and Dream PSU, but Lloyd just read the article I wrote a couple of years ago about the Dream PSU analysis that Voltar had done that kind of warned people that this wasn't as good as the original. Now, before I elaborate, I will fully and wholeheartedly admit that I am overly paranoid about power, and especially with older equipment, retro equipment like this. I always err on the side of caution based on many years of watching power supplies kill things and some very bad experiences I had in the medical field with power supplies that were changed after manufacturing started. So I fully admit I'm being overly paranoid by this, but the issue is that the analysis of the Dream PSU, at least a couple of years ago when Voltar did it, was that they basically just took the power supplies data sheet, slapped it on a board, and it did not end up performing as well as the original. Does that mean you're going to hurt your Dreamcast? I don't really know. So what I would ask you is there a special situation here? Is it something like you live in Europe and you have a Japanese Dreamcast and you're using this in place of a step up or step down converter? If that's the case, maybe keep using it as long as you're not loading up your Dreamcast with extras. So if you have a GDMU and you're not using the original CD-ROM drive and you're using wired controllers and you have a VGA or a SCART output, then you should be totally fine. But if you have stuff like a bunch of Bluetooth adapters being plugged into it, an HDMI adapter that's powered by the Dreamcast itself, maybe you have one of those new wireless controllers that also have to power the VMU as well, now you're drawing a lot more power than was originally anticipated using a power supply that's not powerful enough to handle it. So I would look into other power supply replacements at that point. And I haven't kept up to what are the best for Dreamcast, but I do remember that there are some solid ones out there, and even some open source ones that you could build yourself. And as I word vomited in that article, make sure your external PSU is high quality as well. Because if your internal PSU if it's one of the ones that requires an external brick, if your brick is junk, it doesn't matter how good the internal one is. You're still going to do, you might wear the console down faster, or you might just kill it, or you might kill the power supply, but not good either way. Make sure you have a solid, known, good working external brick. Triad, Meanwell are great brands. There's other brands out there, but those are usually my go-to. But if you're in a scenario which like you live in the US and you have a US Dreamcast, yeah, I would buy an original one and I would see if I can get it recapped, and I would do probably the resistor trick so that you put the dummy load on so that you don't have to worry about the GDMU and extra heat, and I would kind of go from there. But as I said first, I am overly paranoid about that because of real life experience. This isn't nightmares that I'm making up. These are real life things that have happened that have pointed to real life scenarios in which bad power could cause damage or just outright kill the equipment that you're using. So I would kind of just have a think about this and see what's the best angle. I mean, maybe if you already have an expensive and nice Meanwell power supply or a good triad, just look into another internal replacement that's been vetted. And that is something that we should probably work a little bit better on. I believe Christoph did a design for an open source Dreamcast power supply, but I'm not sure who is still selling them. Maybe Laser Bear. I'll leave a link if I could find it. But that's definitely something I should talk to my friends about, is making sure that stores have a bunch of these in stock so we have an easy replacement. Because if the scenario is that you already have everything working perfect and you just want to make sure that your internal board is up to snuff, then it would be really nice to have a quick and easy, point and click, here you go, buy this. So I'll check. I think Laser Bear was still selling them. I think 8-bit mods might have been, in consoles for you. I don't know. I'll see if I could find some links for you. But that's kind of my thoughts on all of that, and my honest warning about my power supply paranoia. Well, that's it for this week. The questions were only on Patreon this week, but anybody that supports on any platform, just feel free to ask whatever question you want. Please just do it in the latest Q&A post, because the way these services work, I can't really figure out what's a new question on an old post. Plus, like you saw here today, I like just scrolling through in real time and answering it as if we were hanging out at an expo or a bar or a coffee shop or something. I like these to be real laid back. So ask any question you'd like. And of course, thank you to everybody who supports in any way, because it really is you who's keeping this all going. So thank you all so much, and I'll see you next week.